All right, Cornel, it's that time again. It is time for office hours, and we are open to do office hours business. And we have a very special topic today. But before we get into the topic, I just want to remind our listeners that this is the weekly segment where we do a deep dive into one of the many intractable issues, and we try to toss the issues around, unpack a little bit here and there, see what we can come up with, or try to answer the unanswerable. And in many ways, this week's question is one of those questions. And it draws from a terrific interview piece in the Washington Post that our dear co-host, Dr. Cornel West, shared an incredible range of answers to very complicated questions in a succinct and clarifying way. One of the most powerful questions asked, I'm hoping we can drill down a little bit and get him to talk a little bit more about. And that question is this: is America even capable of treating the masses of Black people with decency and dignity? I mean, I want to just do a little close read to this phrase that he used, because he didn't just say treating a couple of celebrities who are Black. He didn't say treating the Black people who live right next door to you. He didn't say treating the Black people who you look up to or who is your boss because somebody hired him or her above you. But it's the masses of Black people. That is to say, the unnamed, those who work in groups and who live in groups, who are not one-offs integrating your neighborhood with your permission, but in fact, in some sense, invisible as individuals because of the way we understand race. Can that group of people, can these masses of Black people be treated? Is America even capable of treating this group of people with decency and dignity? Cornel, give us a little bit more about your thoughts about that. I just think it's a profound question.
I think it's a crucial skeleton that hangs in the closet of anybody concerned about Black people or poor people. When Marcus Garvey used to stand on the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, he would say, as long as Black people live in America, the masses of Black people will live lives of ruin and disaster, that they will make place for certain exceptional Black people, exceptional Negroes, he would say. But in terms of their cousins, in terms of Jamal, in terms of Shaniqua, in terms of the folk on the block, around the corner, that they will still be dishonored, they will still be devalued, their bodies will be associated with criminality, and their quest for decency will be pushed to the margins. Now, you see, when you look at the historical data, there's a sense in which Garvey's challenge has not been adequately responded to. Because given all the magnificent, unprecedented progress that we've experienced, especially as middle class expansion taken place, that when it comes to the masses of Black folk in the hoods, in prison and so forth, that their lives still in so many ways echo what Garvey was talking about, ruin and disaster. So the question becomes then, well, what do we do? And this goes back to our point we made before about Henry Highland Garnett saying that for Black people, pharaohs on both sides of the bloody Red Sea. So what do you do everywhere you look up and you run into a different pharaoh? Well, at that point, you just say to yourself, I refuse to be a spectator. I'm going to be a participant, and therefore I'm going to learn how to love, fight, laugh more adequately, effectively, to pass on a tradition to a younger generation, but knowing that no matter what I do, I'm still got so much more work to do if the world's going to be a decent place. So the question becomes, well, how do you just leave the world just a little better than you found it, rather than become overwhelmed by despair because the world is full of so much evil, is full of so much undeserved harm and so on. So that that question is a crucial one, but it's got to be tied to our fight. It's got to be tied to our tenacity. It's got to be tied to our determination, even as we tell the truth about the limits of ourselves, and most importantly, the limits of any society. Every society, empire, social experiment has structural limits and spiritual thresholds. Just like in our own lives, we can only take so much.
Honey, you don't know. Ain't that the truth?
It only takes so much and we snap. Well, that's true for societies. Well, in the case of America, the white supremacy has been so fundamental in the way in which it's proceeded. Once you really begin to call that into question, you begin to see just how sick your fellow citizens are. Not all of them, but enough of them to get you highly discouraged. So the question becomes, well, how do you become encouraged rather than discouraged in light of recognizing sooner or later, America's going to reach its limits?
Yeah. Yeah.
It reached the limits in the 1860s with the Civil War. Things went barbaric. It reached its limits in some ways in the 1960s, where things went barbaric. We just didn't accent it in terms of mass incarceration and vicious treatment of political prisoners and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So that, it's a tough one. But how do you wrestle with that query?
Well, I mean, I guess, my short answer would be no, not at this point. No, not at this point. But at the same time, I guess I would try to make some daylight between the notion of America as a nation state, right? Which I would say as a nation state may not be capable, right, of treating the masses of Black people with dignity. Draw a distinction and some daylight between the nation state and Americans, right? Or citizens or people who inhabit this space. And to say that there's potential for transforming what it means to treat Black people with dignity and decency if we can cultivate and somehow separate whiteness from the national consciousness. Now, here's where, and I'm going to find a way to find some daylight, Cornel. It might just be a tiny little sliver, but but let me see if I can give you a little bit of extra hope. So I'm thinking, if we take this white supremacist fear of 2040 and the countdown to a dominant non-white nation, some people assume that demographic shift will by definition change and reduce the power of the hierarchy of whiteness. I do not believe that's an automatic matter. We have South Africa. Obviously, you can have a majority non-white country that's fully saturated with a white supremacist ideology. But we do have the potential here with such a transformation of immigrant populations from around the world to help disconnect their Americanization from their pro-white potential mindset. That is to say, as immigrants become American, they become aligned with what they see as often, not always, right, obviously, but they often become aligned with the dominant ideology of whiteness as a way of being truly American. And I'm wondering if we as Black people can do some work in that moment, right, to treat immigrant communities as a future investment in ending white supremacy, if we work to develop those solidarities and alliances with those constituencies. And that's, not a excessively hopeful idea, but I think if we're going to have a multiracial world where everyone is relatively proportionate, right? Or that there's small numbers of lots of different kinds of people, that opens the door for a new kind of meshing, right? What connects us? What is the language and politics and ideology and expectations that actually tether us to one another? So we can build, it seems to me, some different networks. Now it's a sliver, bruh. It's a sliver.
No,
I admit.
no, I hear
it's
you.
a
I
sliver.
hear. We all are desperate. We all grabbing for whatever we can grab, and I'll grab that one with you too, because I think what you're talking about is important. But for me, the other side of this thing is that even these sick white brothers and sisters, so many of them are suffering. They don't have medical care. They don't have jobs with a living wage. They don't have decent housing.
No.
You see, if somehow we could satisfy those basic needs so that whatever people perceived about Black people, it could not translate into Black folk not having access to health care, quality education, job with a living wage, or decent housing, then I do think we'd have a different situation, different phenomena. We're not going to eliminate the hatred, but it would have less translation power because we'd have folk who had some material needs satisfied and some of their material needs satisfied, so that the issue of class here and economic justice here becomes so crucial, but it's not in any way a salvation to get us through the white supremacy, but at least it's a crucial step forward in that regard.
Yes,
but see,
yes.
I'm just grabbing for straws.
Yeah, I see your sliver of hope over there too, bruh. No, I
You see
agree.
that little sliver.
That's all. We're just messing with tiny light slivers. But I just want to ask one more thing though about that class argument, because I agree there's no question that the safety nets for working class, middle class, poor whites have been frayed and destroyed, largely by policies that were ended because of integration and access to those policies by non-whites, right? That was the justification for ending so many of them or reducing them. But how much of that safety net do you think whites who are prone to white supremacist extremism, not all whites, just this group, I mean, do you think that if their economic needs got met, that they'd be happy if at the same time other people of color also had opportunities? I mean, isn't there something about, I want a safety net for me and this should be my privilege, not just a requirement because I'm a human being and I should have basic care, which is what I hear you saying, but that I deserve greater privileges because I'm white? And like, how do we separate those two things out?
They historically are tied together. They are part of the cultural DNA of the making of a white supremacist civilization like the United States. I think it probably will always be there to some degree. I think white supremacy is going to be around for a long time. But we can attenuate the worst of it in terms of the injurious harm that could flow in terms of depriving peoples of color with these basic rights to health care and job and house and so forth. They might not want to live next to you, that's fine. They might not like the way you look, that's fine. They don't want to get close to your son or daughter, we understand, but they don't have the power to translate it into such a way that our schools are worse than theirs. But they would like for their schools to be worse than that, but if you got enough institutional clout. But the problem is that in order to reach that kind of policy, you're going to have multiracial coalitions. And if those racial coalitions are weak because of white supremacy and they associate dealing with poverty with dealing with Black people, then the racism makes it difficult to ever deal with their own poverty too. And
exactly.
That's the catch-22 that we've seen over and over again in this society.
Right.
And that's the definition of insanity, as well as a certain spiritual sickness. And just as educators, we try to raise that issue, but we see it among the fellow educators. I mean, it's not like education in and of itself is going to be some major force to
panacea.
Undercut. Exactly. Who's going to educate the educators? You know what I mean? How do you educate the educator? And go on and on and on. It's only the examples of great courage and love and justice that can seize the imagination of people. And that's in the end why I think the art's important. I always remind folk that anytime you come down on America, you should really begin with American music. Because American music has probably been one of the most humanizing forces in a sick society. And I don't mind being profoundly patriotic about Aretha Franklin. I don't mind being patriotic about James Cleveland and Luther Vandross and James Brown. You say, oh, George Clinton, Bootsy Collins. I'm profoundly patriotic because they are as American as cherry pie. And yet they're international in terms of the love that they produce that flows from their souls to every corner of the globe.
And
that's different than
and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, but that's different than what most people associate patriotism to be. And that's why your distinction about the nation state at its worst, on the one hand, American citizens at their best, are two very, very different things. And very few people make that kind of distinction that you make all the time, you made today.
No, thanks. No, you're so right about American music. And to that glorious list, I would also add the ways in which, musicians communicate when they're serious about their musicianship, across race in ways that completely ignore the kinds of categorizations and hierarchies that have been established. So you have like the Muscle Shoals music, context where, whites are crossing the color line to work with Black musicians, in a context where it's a life-threatening activity, frankly. And you see this throughout U.S. history in many different ways. And so the musicians are not only, it's not only Black American musicians in the sense of a kind of global gift, it's also the way the communication and the freedom and the appreciation that musicians have for one another across these so-called boundaries that I think is also hopeful. What they're able to see, what they're able to appreciate, what they know about their differences and their similarities make a huge difference.
It's so true. I got a wonderful note from Brother Winton Marcellus just the other day. I haven't seen Brother Winton in a while, but I always salute his genius and things. He and I, we struggle over various issues, but the degree to which the message that he has about how the music gets at the depths of what it means to be human, and therefore has some kind of spiritual and artistic power.
Right.
And
healing.
That needs to be, and healing, absolutely.
Yeah.
Healing.
Yeah. And there's a way in which it does not always, I would say, it can get below these categories, right? It sort of digs below the boundaries that we've erected. It's like there's a wall and the, music just keeps digging until it gets to the bottom of the wall, comes out the other side. No, it's very true. We should try to talk to Winton about that.
We got to bring Winton on.
Yeah, that would be lovely. That would be a gift. Yeah. Well, thank you for
Erykah Badu. We still talking about Erykah Badu.
I certainly hope so. I'm talking about her. I'm talking about her all the time. Yeah, Baduism is going to help us through a lot. And it's that freedom that that freedom they have of mind, where you're just like, why am I in this box? I don't need to be in this box. I can go be in Baduism. I don't need to mess around with this.
I can be in Badu. That's why I can get on the mothership with George Clinton.
You get on the mothership. You definitely. So there's a lot of places to go. So thank you for this question, though, because I think it's to some it might seem provocative, but I think it's an important one to ask about the masses of Black people. What are we capable of doing and seeing and connecting? So, and I hope people really digest and try to reflect on that critical question. So we are at the end of our office hours right at this point. We're really happy to have you all with us and join us on the tightrope. And our producers, just to remind you, are always looking for your comments and queries. So continue to engage with us on all the platforms, and you just might have your question answered or brought to office hours. So thanks very much. Thanks, Dr. West, for being a great co-host and co-conspirator. And we are thrilled to have had you all on the tightrope. We'll see you again next time. Dear Tightrope family, we are joining Patreon. We're partnering with Patreon because they are empowering creators to maintain independence, thereby allowing us to offer you access to weekly exclusive content. By joining, you will gain access to special opportunities to engage with us as we share what we're reading, offer behind-the-scenes clips from our episodes, and ask you for your input around what we should focus on next. We want to express our sincere gratitude for consideration in joining us on the tightrope and becoming part of our Patreon community. Thank you for helping us to maintain our creative freedom on this righteous journey as we produce and distribute content of high integrity. Together, we can amplify truth, cultivate hope, and work to create a just world. Thank you, and stay strong.
My blessed tightrope family, we are delighted to work with our brothers and sisters at Patreon in order to preserve our independence of mind, to preserve our free spirits, and most importantly, to preserve our quest for truth and for beauty and for goodness. Please be with us on this journey.